Good morning. This is episode 2 of Kant for Everyone on Philosophy for Everyday Life. I'm Jimmy. So, just getting started here. I want to talk about the goal of this series briefly and how I'm approaching it before we dive in. So my goal is to make Kant's thought accessible and understandable to a wide audience. And one way of trying to achieve this objective might be to provide a high-level overview of Kant's work and to skip the scholarly discussions because they do get a bit detailed. But others have already provided such overviews on YouTube. And the downside of this approach is that it doesn't really invite anyone into Kant's work itself. I think these high-level discussions or overviews actually leave us with a pretty inadequate understanding of Kant's work, and with very little sense of how inadequate or inaccurate that understanding might actually be. So it's quite possible that in the end, taking a high-level overview of Kant's work actually creates more misunderstanding than actual genuine understanding. And the other thing about these video overviews is that they fail to invite viewers to explore Kant's work for themselves or to teach them what it might actually mean to have a sort of first-hand knowledge or understanding of Kant's work. So I'm taking an entirely different approach in this series, which is to crack open the Critique of Pure Reason right here on YouTube, to read through some or all of it slowly and carefully, and to examine what the best scholars have had to say about what is arguably the most important work of modern philosophy. So I hope over time that this series will also become a dialogue, with viewers providing questions and comments in real time. So if that's something you're interested in, be sure to subscribe so you can catch the next episode. Before we go further, let me also mention that I'll be holding a series of 6-week philosophy intensives this year. And the first will be called Cultivating an Intellectual Life, and that will be starting on May 4th. So if this is something you're interested in, you can check out the link in the description just to drop me your info. I can keep you up to date. And you can also find me on Substack if you'd like to stay in touch at Philosophy for Everyday Life. So I mentioned last time that I think of learning to read difficult works of philosophy as something like learning a language. And the best way to make progress with a language is just to immerse yourself, even if at first you don't fully understand much of what you're hearing. My hope is that this series will allow you to immerse yourself in Kant's thought by reading his words directly, or by reading the words of others who have written about him and understand him well. I'm going to pause for a moment to turn off my radiator, which may make some noise here. Okay, I'm back. So last time, we looked at 3 commentators on the Critique of Pure Reason, just briefly, Peter Strawson, Martin Heidegger, and Theodor Adorno. I have a feeling I will return to these 3 in the future, but today I want to take a look at 2 additional commentators. One is Norman Kemp Smith, whose translation of the first critique is the primary text I'll be using in this series. Kemp Smith wrote a commentary on the critique in addition to translating it, which was published in 1918 and revised in 1923, so over 100 years ago. The second commentator we'll engage today is H.J. Paton, whose commentary is called Kant's Metaphysic of Experience and was published in 1936. I chose these two commentators for today, both because they're kind of in the canon of commentaries on the critique of pure reason in English, and because they discuss how the critique of pure reason was composed on a literary level. This topic is less prominent in more recent scholarly discussions, but it is important, I think, because it gives us a sense of some of the challenges that arise in reading this text, the critique of pure reason, and how scholars have tried to address those challenges, and also perhaps some of the pitfalls that have been encountered in attempting to address those challenges. So that will hopefully become more clear as we go. I also think looking at Kemp Smith's commentary is helpful just because I'll be using his translation primarily of the first critique, and it will be helpful to have a sense of how the translator understood the text that we're looking at. There are a couple of other matters just to briefly review from last time. One is that I have chosen to use Kemp Smith's translation rather than the more recent Cambridge translation made by Paul Guyer and Alan Wood. I'll certainly refer to that Cambridge translation as we go, but I find Kemp Smith's translation both more readable and I also preferable in some of its translation choices, specifically with the German word Erkenntnis, which I will write here for us. And I did misspell last time. So Erkenntnis, most often translated, I think, knowledge. And this is how Kemp Smith translates it. Guyer and Wood choose the word cognition, which to my mind just implies something different. It's just it's a different kind of resonance. So like if we look at this word epistemology, the study of knowledge, this is based on the Greek word episteme. And I'll mention this again in a moment, but I think Kant is dealing with a lot of Aristotelian ideas and concepts and terms. Well, if we crack open the first pages of Aristotle's Metaphysics, he talks about knowledge. And this word here, episteme, is the word he uses. I don't think Aristotle's Metaphysics would make sense if we used the word cognition. The first line is all men, and of course, there's a non-inclusive language there. All men desire by nature to know. Now, what would it mean if we read Aristotle's opening line there and used all men desire by nature cognition? I don't know. It confuses me. I'm not sure why Guyer and Wood made that choice. And it's a kind of secondary reason why I strongly prefer Kemp Smith's translation. Okay, so that's all for matters of translation. I also mentioned last time that Kant's work is typically thought to be a synthesis of two traditions of philosophical inquiry. And the way I was taught is like this, that there was rationalism. This is mostly on the European continent. Descartes, Leibniz, and I'm going to add Mendelssohn because my dissertation was on Kant and Mendelssohn, and I think he just doesn't get the credit he deserves. And on the other side, we have empiricism, mostly in England and Scotland. So Hume, Locke, Berkeley. That's good enough. And Kant is right here in the middle. He synthesizes these two traditions of philosophical inquiry. Coming out the other side, we have analytic philosophy, which is mostly Anglophone. And over here, maybe it will be easier if I make this pen thinner. We have phenomenology. Or continental European philosophy. I think I'm going to keep the pen how it was. So this framework is very useful for understanding the work of Kant. But I'm going to suggest a second framework. And do I want to put Kant in the middle here? Maybe. Which is that we have Aristotle, or maybe Aristotelian metaphysics and logic. And I think Kant was directly engaged with Aristotle, but we also have Baumgarten. Are there others? Baumgarten is probably the main one. Kant lectured on Baumgarten. And on the other side, we have Augustinian Christianity. We did have a medieval synthesis of these two, especially in someone like Thomas Aquinas. And this broke apart. This synthesis came apart because of three big factors, which were biblical criticism, which really came online in a new way in Kant's lifetime, where the question was raised, do we actually know who wrote these books of the Bible? Did these events actually happen? These questions were raised before, but they were raised in a new way and more comprehensively in the 18th century. So we have biblical criticism, we have Newtonian physics, which casts serious doubt on this tradition of Aristotelian metaphysics, and we have Humean skepticism, which also cast doubt on Aristotelian metaphysics as well as Newtonian physics. And of course, biblical criticism cast doubt on Augustinian Christianity. I think Kant is trying to address all of the problems that are sort of referenced here on this sheet, in addition to the problems that are innate to these two traditions of rationalism and empiricism. So I think having both of these frameworks in mind is useful for thinking about what Kant is up to. So the last thing is that I mentioned that there is an absolutely critical distinction for understanding Kant's thought, which is the distinction between the empirical and the intelligible. This distinction will more or less map on to other terms that we see in Kant, like the empirical is associated with the a posteriori. That's basically another word for the same thing, versus the intelligible is the a priori. Another pair would be, of course, the phenomenal and the noumenal. Another would be appearances versus things in themselves. This is a case where I think the importance of Aristotle is just underrated. I have never heard someone explain this term, things in themselves, with reference to Aristotle, but Aristotle uses this term. We don't need to get into that right now, but it's a good example of the one potential line of influence. Kant will also, to continue with this empirical intelligible distinction, under empirical we have science. Under intelligible we have, we'll call it pure philosophy. Over here we have like anthropology. Kant basically founded the modern discipline of anthropology, versus over here we have moral philosophy. Anthropology, we might also add moral psychology. One complaint I've heard about Kant is that his moral philosophy doesn't have a corresponding moral psychology or an account of kind of the human person and its capacities. Um, I think the complaint is misses that Kant's method always makes this strict distinction between empirical and intelligible. And so when he's doing just moral philosophy, he's going to bracket questions about human beings because that comes into that's sort of an empirical or applied question that he would deal with over here in his moral psychology, which he does. Okay, so I think that's all by way of. Looks like I dropped out for a second there, but hopefully everything is good. Okay, hopefully I can keep going here. Okay, so this is Norman Kemp Smith's commentary on the Critique of Pure Reason. First edition, published in 1918. Okay, so this is helpful. Getting some quality issues here. Let's see. It's healthy. Okay, hopefully we're okay. If you happen to be watching and the quality is posing a problem, I'd love to hear from you in the chat. So this is Norman Kemp Smith's preface to his commentary. He writes, "The Critique of Pure Reason is more obscure and difficult than even a metaphysical treatise has any right to be. The difficulties are not merely due to defects of exposition. They multiply rather than diminish upon detailed study. And as I shall endeavor to show in this commentary, are traceable to two main causes: the composite nature of the text, written at various dates throughout the period 1769 to 1780, and the conflicting tendencies of Kant's own thinking." So Kemp Smith says this book is way too hard than it should be, even given the subject matter. It gets harder as you study it, and the two reasons are: one, that the text was put together from manuscripts that were written over a long period of time, about 12 years, and as well as conflicts within Kant's own thinking. So that's it for that preface. Let's look here at his introduction. Kemp Smith writes, "Seldom in the history of literature has a work been more conscientiously and deliberately thought out, or more hastily thrown together, than the Critique of Pure Reason." This is a very famous line. The following is the account which Kant, in a letter to Moses Mendelssohn, August 6th, 1783, has given of its composition. "Though the critique is the outcome of reflection which had occupied me for a period of at least 12 years, I brought it to completion in the greatest haste, within some 4 to 5 months, giving the closest attention to the content, but with little thought of the exposition, or of rendering it easy of comprehension by the reader. A decision which I have never regretted, since otherwise, had I any longer delayed, and sought to give it a more popular form, the work would probably never have been completed at all. This defect can, however, be gradually removed, now that the work exists in a rough form." So he just wanted to get it out. Kant writes something similar to Garve around the same time. And this is what Kemp Smith has to say about it. "The critique is not merely defective in clearness or popularity of exposition. That is a common failing of metaphysical treatises, especially when they are in the German language, and might pass without special remark. What is much more serious is that Kant flatly contradicts himself in almost every chapter, and that there is hardly a technical term which is not employed by him in a variety of different and conflicting senses. As a writer, he is the least exact of all the great thinkers. And keep in mind that this is from someone who translated the critique from German into English. And if you remember the story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but the story is that German philosophy professors would have their German students read Kemp Smith's English translation to help them understand the German. I'm just going to read these highlighted portions. Kemp Smith is saying, based on these manuscripts that were released around the time of his commentary, it can now be proved that the critique is not a unitary work, it's not a unified whole, and that in the 5 months in which, as Kant tells us, it was brought to completion, it was not actually written, but was pieced together by the combining of manuscripts written at various dates throughout the period 1769 to 1780. So Kant had 12 years worth of manuscripts, and he realized he needed to get this book out, and he basically kind of mechanically stitched these things together. This is called the patchwork theory. As we shall have constant occasion to observe, the critique affords ample evidence of having been more or less mechanically constructed through the piecing together of older manuscript, supplemented no doubt by the insertion of connecting links, and modified by occasional alterations to suit the new context. Kant, it would almost seem, objected to nothing so much as the sacrifice of an argument once consecrated by committal to paper. Okay, that's interesting. What scholars ended up doing, especially German scholars who were writing just before Kemp Smith, was to try to sort out the layers, like try to actually make a chronology of the development of Kant's thought by separating out what seemed to be different arguments in different parts or even in the same parts. It's interesting because that project was attempted for the Bible as well around this period in Germany, where with something called source criticism, where the idea was the Bible itself, especially the first 5 books, were also composed of different manuscripts that were kind of stitched together by an editor. So this was kind of a trend in German scholarship at the time. A lot of ingenuity went into it. It more or less has died out as a scholarly enterprise, both for an author like Kant as well as for the Bible, which tells you something about how productive it was or was not. Okay, we'll read a few more comments from Kemp Smith here. The composite character of the critique is largely concealed by the highly elaborate and extremely artificial arrangement of its parts. To the general plan, based upon professedly logical principles, Kant has himself given the title architectonic, and he carries it out with a thoroughness to which all other considerations, and even at times those of sound reasoning, are made to give way. So Kant took these very disparate arguments collected in these manuscripts over 12 years and forces it together into this framework that he's constructed. Kemp Smith continues, we have still to consider the chief reason for the contradictory character of the contents of the critique. It is inseparably bound up with what may perhaps be regarded as Kant's supreme merit as a philosophical thinker, especially as shown in the first critique, namely his open-minded recognition of the complexity of his problems and of the many difficulties which lie in the way of any solution which he is himself able to propound. So Kemp Smith gives him some credit here and says, yes, it was kind of mechanically thrown together, forced together, and then that composite construction was concealed by this sort of overarching logical framework. But to Kant's credit, he recognized the complexity of the problems he was trying to solve and refused to sort of settle down on just one simple solution. He wanted to keep all of these different aspects of the problem in play. So here's what Kant says himself. You know that I do not approach reasonable objections with the intention merely of refuting them, but that in thinking them over, I always weave them into my judgments and afford them the opportunity of overturning all my most cherished beliefs. So some real intellectual honesty there. I entertain the hope that by thus viewing my judgments impartially, from the standpoint of others, some third view that will improve upon my previous insight may be obtainable. Long experience has taught me that insight into a subject which I am seeking to master is not to be forced, or even hastened by sheer effort, but demands a fairly prolonged period during which I return again and again to the same concepts, viewing them in all their aspects and in their widest possible connections. While in the intervals, the skeptical spirit awakens and makes trial whether my conclusions can withstand a searching criticism. That's a really nice window into Kant's process of doing philosophy and writing philosophy. Basically, he's trying to take all the objections into account. He's saying you can't just force your way through a philosophical problem. You have to give it time to sort of mature. And you have these insights that you put together, that you write, that you assemble. And then in between, you allow this skeptical spirit to kind of interrogate what you've done. So Kemp Smith comments, we find Kant constantly alternating between opposed standpoints, to no one of which he definitely commits himself, and constantly restating his principles in the effort to remove the objections to which, as he recognizes, they continue to lie open. The critique, as already stated, is not the exposition of a single unified system, but is the record of Kant's manifold attempts to formulate and to solve his many-sided problems. To my mind, this perspective alone explains why we need to read Kant himself. We need to actually look at his texts rather than relying on summaries or kind of takeaways. Because if Kant is really working by experimenting philosophically, by trying out different positions, by sitting with them for an extended period, we can't even begin to approximate an understanding of what he's up to with a kind of detached summary. It requires getting into the text. Okay. So I think this is the last tidbit from Kemp Smith. Recognition of the composite nature of the text, so the way this was patched together from different manuscripts written over a long period of time, will safeguard us in two ways. In the first place, citation of single passages is quite inconclusive. You can't just pull a passage from Kant and say, hey, look, this is what he thinks. Not only must all the relevant passages be collated, they must be interpreted in light of an historical understanding of the various stages in Kant's development. So he's saying, okay, if you want to know what Kant thinks about subject XYZ, you can't just be like, well, here, I found a passage about it. You have to look through all of his work. You have to find all the passages about it. And then you have to arrange those passages chronologically to figure out how Kant's thought developed over time so that you can make sense of the differences. Now, that's a very difficult project. That is a very difficult project. Difficult, if not absolutely impossible, especially that last part where you try to reconstruct the development of Kant's thought. So that gets us gives us a good picture of Kemp Smith's approach to reading the First Critique. I think we can now go over to H.J. Paton. His commentary is called Kant's Metaphysic of Experience. It comes in 2 volumes, published in 1936. And this is the epigraph that Paton chose for his commentary series by Coleridge, the English poet. Coleridge writes, the writings of the illustrious sage of Königsberg, that's Kant, the founder of the critical philosophy, more than any other work, at once invigorated and disciplined my understanding. The originality, the depth, and the compression of the thoughts, the novelty and subtlety, yet solidarity and importance of the distinctions, the adamantine chain of the logic, and I will venture to add, paradox as it will appear to those who have taken their notion of Immanuel Kant from reviewers and Frenchmen, the clearness and evidence of the Critique of Pure Reason, took possession of me with a giant's hand. Paton is already cluing us in to the fact that he's going to take a different approach than Kemp Smith by placing this epigraph from Coleridge, which mentions the clearness of the critique of pure reason. It's quite interesting. Okay, so here is Paton's preface. I think I will read a couple pages here. So he writes, "It is a scandal to philosophical scholarship, and not least to German philosophical scholarship, that more than 150 years after the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason, 250 years now for us, we still lack a commentary comparable with such works as that of Pacius on the Organon of Aristotle, or even that of Adam on the Republic of Plato. Of all the authors who write about Kant's greatest work, there is none who condescends to explain it sentence by sentence. Hans Weihinger, who alone set out to do so, attempted to write a commentary not only upon the critique, but upon all its previous commentators in the tradition of German scholarship. And as was but natural, he gave up this impossible task when he had proceeded but a little way. In the absence of a detailed commentary, we have an inevitable welter of conflicting opinions about Kant's doctrines. More serious still, the unfortunate student, and even if I may judge from my own experience, many teachers of philosophy have the vaguest idea as to the meaning of Kant's words. This is still true. There are sentences in which the reader is unable to decide to which of several nouns the relative and demonstrative pronouns refer, or which of two nouns is to be regarded as subject and which as object. In vain do we look for a reliable guide, even in these elementary matters. And the plain fact is that most students find many passages, and too often crucial passages, to which they can attach no meaning at all. It is not surprising that they accept the opinions of others at second hand without being able either to confirm or to criticize them. And that is what we are trying to overcome in this series. It is not my aim to write a commentary of the type required. This is a task which should be reserved to a German writing for Germans. Nevertheless, where the language is most difficult, and especially in such passages as the transcendental deduction and the argument of the analogies, I have attempted to analyze Kant's thought almost sentence by sentence, and everywhere I have sought to give chapter and verse for my interpretations." Okay, that's good. This seems worth taking a look at. So, if the critic, the reader or commentator, finds the whole argument to be unintelligible or fallacious of a work that he or she is commenting on, only very special circumstances can justify him in writing a commentary at all. So you can see Paton challenging those who have written commentaries on Kant's work and say, turns out Kant's thought doesn't make any sense. He says, if that's the case, why would you bother writing a commentary? On the other hand, if he or she professes to find intelligible an argument which he manifestly does not understand, he can have no justification in any circumstances. So if you say, I have no idea what Kant is saying, but I think I understand. Wait, what do you mean? I don't know what Paton is saying actually. To profess to find intelligible an argument which you do not understand. Okay. I'm not sure exactly what he's getting at. I'm going to keep going. Nevertheless, he can be expected to exhibit the intelligibility of his author only within certain limits. He cannot be asked to meet all possible criticisms or to expound his author in the terms of current philosophical controversy. For my own part, I believe Kant's argument to be intelligible, though I do not profess to understand all its ramifications. So there's intelligibility versus sort of full understanding. I have sought to expound his doctrine in his own terminology, since I am convinced it is only by becoming familiar with his terms that we can follow his argument. This goes back to this idea of learning philosophy as something like learning a language. And analogously, learning the work of a specific philosopher being something like learning the language of that philosopher. Okay, so it's also worth noting Paton refers to the translation of Kemp Smith that we will be using here. He says, on very few occasions, I have felt obliged to differ expressly from Mr. Kemp Smith's translations. It must not be thought from this that I fail to appreciate the services he has rendered in this field. He has given us, for the first time, an English translation which those who are unfortunately innocent of German may study, with some hope of being able to follow the argument as Kant intended it. I am the more glad to acknowledge these services because my own interpretation of the critique differs completely from his, and because, in view of the wide acceptance of his doctrines, I may at times have expressed my disagreement with undue vehemence. Okay. Skip forward here. This is Paton's introduction. Just a few more tidbits from Paton. So Kant and his critics. It is an irony of fate that Immanuel Kant, who declared the Critique of Pure Reason to be intelligible only to those who understood it as a whole, should be beset by commentators who maintain that there is no whole to understand. So Paton comes out the gate criticizing this patchwork theory that we find Kemp Smith advocating, which, just to reiterate, is the idea that the Critique of Pure Reason was hastily thrown together, mechanically assembled from a series of manuscripts that Kant had written over the course of 12 years. The contrast between the two contentions is striking. It seems hardly possible to find a middle way between them. On the one hand, we have the doctrine, widely accepted today, that the Critique is a mosaic of passages dating from different times and externally connected with one another, so that in the words of a distinguished modern commentator, Kemp Smith, Kant flatly contradicts himself in almost every chapter, and we read those words a moment ago. On the other hand, we have Kant's indignant repudiation of such a view. Kant writes, in every writing, above all when it proceeds as a free discussion, it is possible to ferret out apparent contradictions by comparing together isolated passages torn from their context. Such apparent contradictions cast a prejudicial light upon it in the eyes of those who depend upon criticism at second hand, but they can be easily solved by anyone who has mastered the idea as a whole. So Kant is saying, if you get the idea, if you get the fundamental idea that I'm expressing, the contradictions will not be an issue. Of this, Kant was so convinced that he wrote the Prolegomena only in order that he might help his readers to master the idea as a whole. He thought that when he had done so, the difficulty of understanding him would disappear, and that those who still found him unintelligible would be well advised to employ their talents in sciences other than metaphysics, a subject which, after all, it is not necessary that everybody should study. The Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics is a work that Kant wrote maybe 5 or 6 years after the Critique was first published. It's basically a sort of summary and distillation. Okay, so we have this patchwork theory. We've already talked about this more or less. I don't think we need to read this in detail. But Paton engages Adikes, I'm not sure how to pronounce that guy's name, and Weihinger, who are the German scholars that developed this theory. And this is his conclusion. To my mind, the whole discussion is a monument of wasted ingenuity, rendered the more pathetic by the learning and clarity of the exposition. Incredible scholarship and a complete waste of time. That's basically his view on the patchwork theory. Okay, this is worth reading in a little more detail. No one need deny that Kant's mind, like that of other philosophers, worked on different levels, that he thought out some problems more fully than others, and that he was capable of solving one problem without at first realizing all its implications in relation to other problems. Nor need one deny that the notes which he had by him as he brought the Critique into its final form were on different levels of reflection and may have influenced the critique as we have it today. I think myself that the inequalities in Kant's thought have been grotesquely exaggerated, and I see no reason to suppose that he ever made use of any notes without that rewriting which is mentioned in the account of his method given by Borowski. I do not wish, however, to argue either of these points, and I recognize that here there may well be differences of opinion. What I wish to protest against is the doctrine that Kant took isolated and contradictory notes, dating from different periods, and joined them together in a purely external manner. That is, like, sort of without any thought. I just mechanically stitched them together. If there are any who think that this description exaggerates the doctrine of Weihinger, I can only ask them to reread what he has written in his monograph on the transcendental deduction. So he says, go read Weihinger's work for yourself, and you'll see that this is his position. I venture to hold both that the general theory of Weihinger is incredible, unbelievable, and that its detailed application is demonstrably false. The finding of contradictions in Kant had become with him almost an obsession. So Weihinger was obsessed with uncovering these contradictions in Kant and using them to reconstruct the manuscript kind of history of the first critique, of these different manuscripts that were patched together. Okay. Paton continues, "It is not my experience of the human mind that inconsistencies of thought and expression are always or even generally due to differences in the date of writing." So he's saying, like, Weihinger assumes that if you find a contradiction in Kant, it must be because, this one idea is what Kant thought in 1775, and this other idea is what Kant thought in 1780, and we can start to date the different thoughts and construct a sort of reconstruct how Kant's thought developed over time. He's saying that doesn't even make sense as a theory of how human beings think. Nevertheless, this is a possible explanation, and it may be held in a reasonable form, especially when we are considering a work of great length, like the Critique. What so many people fail to realize is the immense gap between holding such a general theory and attempting to determine on this basis the order in which the work was composed. So even if you do accept the theory, implementing it in the kind of reconstruction of someone's thought, of how it developed over time, is quite difficult. And he adds, "It must be remembered that the burden of proof lies not upon those who treat the Critique as the unitary work which it professes to be, but upon those who claim to distinguish the different strata of which it is composed, like geological strata. He's saying, if you believe in the patchwork theory, the burden of proof is on you, in other words. So he says it will be a sufficient refutation of the patchwork theory in its extreme form if it can be shown that the Critique, and especially the transcendental deduction, is an argument. Not necessarily a valid argument, and certainly not a clear argument, but one which might be set forth by an able thinker breaking new and difficult ground. That, to the best of my ability, is what I hope to do." He has a few more kind of harsh things to say, which I appreciate. He says, if the patchwork theory is true, the study of the Critique ought to be removed from the philosophical curricula of the universities. Why study this work if it doesn't really contain an argument? The essence of criticism, and the only way in which we can penetrate more deeply into the mind of an author, is to check our interpretation of one passage in the light of another until gradually the whole becomes clear. So rather than looking for contradictions and trying to sort out these manuscripts or these layers of composition, use the contradictions to check our understanding until a clear picture emerges. Another unfortunate but inevitable consequence of the patchwork theory is the atmosphere of condescension with which the name of Kant is now surrounded. And I've observed this both in scholarly writing on Immanuel Kant and in a classroom setting. He's kind of unavoidable. His influence is unavoidable. And he's also is indeed treated with a lot of condescension for not thinking of this or that, for contradictions, inconsistencies, whatever. So what is Kant's own view of the Critique? The patchwork theory is an attempt, although in my opinion a mistaken attempt, to solve a real problem, the problem of the critique's difficulty and obscurity. So no one disagrees with that, except perhaps for Coleridge, who mentioned its clarity in that epigraph. This has been a continuous subject of complaint from the time of publication until now. On this matter, the opinion of Kant himself is at least worthy of being examined. He fears that his attempt to solve the problem of Hume will meet with the same fate, which, in spite of the subtlety and attractiveness of Hume's style, greeted the original statement of it. So he fears that he will be misunderstood just like Hume was misunderstood. It will be wrongly criticized because it is misunderstood, and it will be misunderstood because, though people may be prepared to read the pages through, they will not take the trouble to think the thought through. So it requires not just reading Kant for himself, but thinking with Kant, getting into his thoughts in a way. This is an interesting little footnote. This is worth reading. If our interpretation is contradicted by other passages, we are compelled to reconsider it, and so we may come nearer the truth. On the patchwork theory, there is no such compulsion to reconsider our interpretations, and the way is open for purely subjective impressions. So, as much as the patchwork theory is impressive on a scholarly level, it also allows for a sort of subjective interpretation of any given passage to remain in place. And I like this footnote. Kemp Smith, for example, habitually distinguishes what he calls the true critical teaching from the doctrines propounded by Kant. Even the fact that the doctrine of pure intuition is consistently held by Kant and regarded by him as an integral part of his system does not, of course, suffice to render it genuinely critical. So Kemp Smith says, I figured out what the true heart of Kant's thought is, and we can kind of shed or discard the other bits. This is a theme in the scholarship. We looked at Peter Strawson last time. I think Strawson is basically taking this kind of approach to Kant. And it will come up again. We'll look at Henry Allison at some point. But I have a note here, which I don't think you'll be able to see. But this is Kant responding to someone's review, an early review. Kant writes, since the reviewer finally maintains that the critique is not to be taken literally in what it says about sensibility, and that anyone who wants to understand the critique must first master the requisite standpoint, because Kant's precise words, like Aristotle's, will destroy the spirit. So he's saying the reviewer tells us that you can't take Kant's words literally. You have to understand kind of the meaning behind them. And Kant responds, I therefore declare again that the critique is to be understood by considering exactly what it says. So Kant was dealing with this problem in his lifetime. And I appreciate this as a sort of methodological principle for reading the first critique, which is pay attention to the words, actually look at what it says. Don't think you know what it says or what the idea is behind it, and sort of ignore the way that Kant says it. And I need to credit Christopher Insull and his book Kant and the Creation of Freedom for that passage. It's cited on page 96. Okay. Let's read just a bit more from Paton. We may not get back to the preface today, but that's okay. So Kant has no use for those philosophers whose only philosophy is the history of philosophy, and who are therefore opposed to all new ideas, although they maintain that these new ideas have all been expressed before. Such philosophers ought by now to be on Kant's side, and perhaps to a certain extent they are, because it's been a while since Kant wrote. But this advantage, if it be an advantage, is more than counterbalanced by the fact that so much of Kant's terminology, which at the time had an accepted and precise meaning, has been forgotten. Even a slight acquaintance with the writings of Baumgarten, who I mentioned earlier, and G.F. Meyer, and especially with Kant's own lectures on logic and on anthropology, is a great help for the study of the critique. And in its absence, many points seem obscure and pedantic, which at the time must have been regarded as obvious. I think this is very true. And again, this is why I mention Aristotelian metaphysics as a critical piece of background context for understanding Kant. So many of his terms are come directly from Aristotle, perhaps by way of Baumgarten, but I think Kant was also reading Aristotle directly. Okay. Why is Kant so difficult? I believe we are getting nearer to the deeper reasons for the seeming obscurity of Kant. The deeper reasons, not the patchwork theory, not the way that the book was composed. Not indeed that we can ascribe that obscurity by a sort of Copernican revolution entirely or even mainly to the prejudices of his critics and their unwillingness or incapacity to attain an inside view of his philosophy, to understand it for themselves. The main explanation lies in the fact that the critique is opening up a world of altogether new ideas, that Kant is undertaking the most difficult task ever undertaken on behalf of metaphysics, and that the human mind does not, in an enterprise of this kind, detect at first the shortest path toward its goal. Kant has had a new vision of reality, and in such a vision there must always be difficulty for those to whom it is imparted, and an element of struggle and effort, even for the seer himself. So that's Kemp Smith thinks that's why this book is truly difficult. Okay, this paragraph is nice. The obscurity to be found in Kant has been greatly exaggerated. As a writer, he is very much clearer than most of his critics, and many of the alleged contradictions exist only in their imagination and are due to misunderstandings for which Kant is not to be held responsible. So again, the patchwork theory is predicated on this idea, as Kemp Smith said, that there are contradictions in every chapter. And Paton says, I'm not so sure. I think the extent of the contradictions is exaggerated and is based on a failure of understanding on the part of the commentators. It's not based on due to failure on Kant's part or to the existence of real contradictions. That said, one source of obscurity is carelessness in the use of language. The critique proceeds as a free discourse, a dialogue of the soul with itself, and if we expect that the same word is always to be used in precisely the same sense, we shall certainly be disappointed. This is another reason why I do not prefer the translation of Geyer and Wood, because as they note in their preface or introduction, they strive to reproduce the exact, to have a sort of correspondence between one English word and one German word. But if Paton is right that Kant doesn't do that, Kant doesn't always use the same word with the same meaning, a good English translation should be aware of this and should, you could always use brackets or something to say, hey, this is the German word here. But if it has a different meaning, you should choose a different English word. And this is another reason why I'm not satisfied with Geyer and Wood's translation. This is another useful tidbit. There's another point which must always be remembered. Kant held that in philosophy, definitions should come at the end rather than at the beginning. Some philosophers deny this, but even they ought to recognize that Kant has chosen to express his thought in a different way from theirs. He is not stating the results of his thought or building up a system upon certain definitions. He is rather thinking aloud and asking us to share in the conversation. To change the metaphor, We must do our best to follow him up the steep and thorny way of the critique, and then consider whether we can see the wide prospect which he claims to see. If we insist on each step being justified before we take the next, we shall never see anything. I very much appreciate that. Okay, we are at nearly an hour. The last things I have highlighted here. This is a nice spot to end. There's much in Kant, much even in the first half of the critique, which is still to me personally dark and difficult. Nevertheless, many passages, which at one time were obscure to me, have with further study become clear. And remember that this is the opposite of the experience that Kemp Smith had, where he said the more you study, the less clear it becomes. And I think that I have discovered the meaning of some arguments which have been widely misunderstood. This has encouraged me to believe that other difficulties are in principle soluble, and I'm convinced that the prevailing view of Kant in this country fails to do justice to him. The confused and pedantic thinker portrayed by some commentators seems hardly the sort of person to set all Germany in a philosophical ferment, and to initiate a series of movements whose repercussions in other countries are far from having ceased, even at the present time. That is true today, almost 100 years later. It is possible to look upon all these movements as misguided, and I suppose this is what Mr. Bertrand Russell means by calling Kant a misfortune. Yet to say this is not to deny Kant some elements of greatness, for to be a misfortune in modern philosophy must require considerable gifts, even if they are of a non-philosophical kind. If we regard Kant, to put it at its lowest, as the Mrs. Eddy of philosophy, the nature of his influence would still require to be explained, and its source is not to be found merely in his moral fervor, and still less in his gifts of rhetoric. I believe myself that if we can penetrate, even imperfectly, into the argument of the critique, we shall find something other than a pedantic old professor, armed with an external, architectonic, incompetently tacking together old notes of what he used to think. We shall find a powerful and penetrating intellect, struggling and twisting relentlessly towards its goal. So you may have detected my sympathies. Kemp Smith is an important scholar, and of course he gave us a wonderful translation. My sympathy lies with Paton, that I think by seeking to understand Kant sympathetically, by taking his words at face value, and when we find things that seem like contradictions, rather than complaining that Kant contradicts himself in every chapter, checking our own understanding, revising our own understanding until some kind of coherent, intelligible whole emerges. So that is the procedure that we'll take in this series. So we're at an hour. If you are here, hello and welcome. This is live right now. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed your chat. But it is live, and I will be back next week for more discussion of the critique of pure reason, and hopefully for many weeks after that. I will also mention, go ahead and subscribe if you'd like to be notified when these are going to happen. I'm doing a series of philosophy intensives. They're going to be 6-week programs where we meet once a week and have a series of readings and some writing as well, and hopefully develop a sort of lively conversation and sense of a community in these cohorts, in these intensives. The first one will be starting the week of May 4th, and it will be called Cultivating an Intellectual Life. So if you want to know more about that, I have a form in the description which you can take a look at, and you can also find me on Substack. So thank you to those of you who are here. Hello, welcome, and goodbye. I hope to see you again.